5 years ago, a respected New Hampshire surgeon vanished on his way to a medical conference, leaving behind his wife, his patients, and a mystery that baffled investigators. His rental car was found abandoned, wiped clean, no fingerprints, no clues. The trail went cold, until one night, inside a Texas emergency room, a doctor made a discovery that would reopen the case and lead to a secret that defied imagination. What began as a routine surgery would unravel a conspiracy so vast and so dark, it stretched across continents and expose one of the most chilling medical crimes in modern history. Before we dive into this unbelievable true story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love gripping real-life mysteries like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is one you won't forget. In the fall of 2012, Dr. Samuel Alcott, a well-respected surgeon from the quiet town of Concord, New Hampshire, packed his neatly pressed suits, kissed his wife on the porch, and promised to call once he landed in Chicago for a medical conference. That call never came. When authorities found his rental car abandoned at a rest stop in Vermont, the inside was spotless. Too spotless. Not a single fingerprint, not a trace of DNA. It was as if someone had carefully erased every sign he'd ever been there. For 5 long years, his disappearance became another cold case buried under stacks of unanswered questions, leaving his wife and teenage daughter trapped in the limbo of hope and grief. Then, one humid October night in 2017, more than 1,000 miles away, a Texas emergency room became the stage for something that would shake the medical world to its core. At San Antonio Medical Center, trauma surgeon Dr. Elena Garza was in the middle of a desperate fight to save a young man's life. The air in the operating room was thick, a mixture of metallic blood, antiseptic, and fear. Overhead monitors blared alarms that rose and fell like a heartbeat on the edge of silence. The patient, Victor Ramos, barely 21, was slipping fast. "Vitals are crashing," shouted Dr. Eris Thorne, the anesthesiologist, his voice strained through his mask. "BP's 80/50 and dropping." "I know, Eris. Stay with me," Garza snapped, her focus razor-sharp despite the chaos. Victor had been dumped at the ER doors hours earlier by 2 men who vanished before anyone could question them. No ID, no medical history, only a broken body, and a story that didn't make sense. His chart mentioned a surgery months before at some unknown clinic near the Mexican border, but the records were conveniently missing. Now, Garza was elbow-deep in a battlefield of inflamed tissue and spreading infection. Every cut bled too much. Every touch risked disaster. "Retractors," she ordered, her voice low but firm. The scrub nurse responded instantly, widening the view into what looked less like a human abdomen and more like a war zone. That's when she saw it. Something embedded near the stomach wall, cocooned in scar tissue. It wasn't organic. It wasn't a tumor or gallstone. The edges were too clean, too geometric. "What in the world?" she murmured, reaching for a pair of long forceps. Carefully, she probed the object, trying not to damage the surrounding organs. Whatever it was, it didn't belong inside a human body. The resistance was absolute. She applied more pressure, and slowly the object began to shift beneath her hands, revealing flashes of white beneath the slimy film of infection. "Almost there," she whispered, half to herself, half to the unconscious man fighting for his life. A moment later, it came free, a small rectangular piece, slick with blood and bile, roughly the size of a credit card. Garza held it up under the glare of the surgical lights. The room fell into stunned silence, every pair of eyes fixed on the strange, glistening object. "Suction," she ordered softly, "and irrigation. Let's clean this up." The nurse poured saline over it, and as the grime washed away, the details emerged. Plastic laminate, faded ink, and a familiar hospital logo. Concord Hospital, Dr. Samuel Alcott. Expiration date, September 6th, 2019. Garza froze. The man in the photo, mid-40s, Glasses, gentle smile, blue scrubs. Was a stranger to her, but not to the story she would soon uncover. His face had been on missing persons bulletins for years. Somehow, his hospital ID, the calling card of a vanished man, was sealed inside the body of a dying stranger. The operating room, once filled with the sound of machines and movement, went eerily quiet. Garza felt a chill crawl up her spine. This wasn't just a surgical anomaly. This was a message, one buried deep within flesh, waiting 5 years to be found. "Doctor, his pressure's bottoming out," Harris warned, his voice slicing through the fog of disbelief. The urgency snapped Dr. Elena Garza back to the moment. The mystery in the basin would have to wait. "Right," she said sharply, locking her focus on the patient. "2 units of packed red cells, stat." She slid the plastic bag containing the bloodied hospital ID back into the sterile basin, her fingers trembling just slightly. There would be time to process it later. Now, there was a life to save. For the next hour, the operating room pulsed with urgency. The hiss of oxygen, the hum of machines, the rhythmic beeping of monitors marking the fragile line between survival and loss. As Garza worked, the image of that smiling man on the ID card burned into her thoughts. A stranger's face, preserved in plastic, hidden inside another man's body. It wasn't a coincidence. It felt intentional, deliberate. A message from someone unseen, or maybe from someone who was never supposed to be found. By dawn, the worst had passed. Victor Ramos was alive, stabilized, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads in the ICU. Exhaustion weighed heavy on Garza's shoulders, but adrenaline and disbelief kept her from resting. Instead of heading to the doctor's lounge, she walked straight down the sterile hallway toward the hospital's administration wing, carrying the basin like it contained something radioactive. Inside the office, fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she handed the sealed biohazard bag to the hospital's legal counsel and the 2 uniformed officers waiting beside him. As the bag left her hands, Garza felt a chill run through her. Whatever this was, it didn't end here. She had opened the first door in what was clearly a very dark hallway. The ID card's trail led investigators to Concord Hospital in New Hampshire, where a single phone call would unravel the fragile piece of a life rebuilt from grief. The name on the file was unmistakable. Dr. Samuel Alcott, missing, presumed dead since 2012. And the emergency contact still listed in his records was Dr. Charlotte Alcott, his widow. At that very moment, hundreds of miles away, the steady click and hiss of a ventilator filled the pediatric operating room at Concord Hospital. For Dr. Charlotte Alcott, those mechanical sounds were more than background noise. They were her heartbeat, her rhythm, her sanctuary. Here, among scalpels and monitors, the world made sense. Every variable was known, every danger measurable. It had been 5 long years since her husband disappeared without a trace. 5 years since he kissed her goodbye on a crisp New England morning, suitcase in hand, and promised to call from Chicago. The call never came. The car was found later, abandoned on the Massachusetts Turnpike, cleaned so thoroughly it was almost sterile. No blood, no struggle, no clues. For months, the investigation turned up nothing. Eventually, the headlines faded, the calls stopped, and Charlotte learned to exist within the silence. She threw herself into work, anesthesiology becoming both her refuge and her armor. Controlling life and death, even for a few hours a day, gave her a sense of order when everything else had been chaos. Now, in October of 2017, she stood at the head of an operating table, carefully adjusting the flow of desflurane gas for a small child undergoing laparoscopic surgery. The monitors read perfectly, heart steady, oxygen levels flawless. This was her calm, her balance, until the doors burst open. The pneumatic hiss broke her focus. A rush of cold air swept in from the hallway, carrying the faint smell of disinfectant and anxiety. Mrs. Gable, an administrative supervisor known for her composure, stepped inside. pale, wide-eyed, visibly shaken. No one interrupted a surgery unless something was terribly wrong. "Dr. Alcott," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her effort to stay professional. "You need to come out, right now." Charlotte's eyes narrowed behind her surgical mask. "I'm in the middle of a procedure, Mrs. Gable. Whatever it is, it'll have to wait." "It can't," the supervisor whispered, wringing her hands. "Dr. Hayes is already scrubbed in to relieve you. There's been an urgent call from the hospital board." A murmur rippled through the operating team. Charlotte hesitated. Professional instinct told her to stay, but something in Mrs. Gable's expression made her chest tighten. Slowly, she backed away from the table, heart pounding. Whatever was waiting for her outside that door wasn't hospital business. It was personal, and it was about to change everything. "It's about your husband." The words hit harder than any physical blow. For Dr. Charlotte Alcott, it felt like an electric current surged through her veins. 5 years of silence and sleepless nights condensed into a single, devastating heartbeat. Simon. His name alone was enough to crack the fragile shell she'd built around her life. Her hands trembled as she stepped back from the anesthesia machine. Dr. Hayes smoothly took her place, but Charlotte barely noticed. The sterile room that had always been her refuge now felt suffocating, the air too thin to breathe. Stripping off her gloves and surgical gown, she followed Mrs. Gable into the hallway, her mind spinning. The walk to the administrative wing stretched endlessly under the cold fluorescence. Each buzzing light above seemed to echo her pulse. Fast, unsteady, fearful. What could this be? Had they found remains? Was this the closure she'd begged for and feared in equal measure? Closure meant finality, and finality meant the end of hope. When she entered the boardroom, the air felt heavy, funereal. The members of the hospital's executive board sat in rigid silence around a mahogany table, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of pity and unease. Mr. Rutherford, the hospital's CEO, stood at the head of the table. His voice, usually warm and commanding, came out low and careful. "Dr. Alcott," he began, "we received a call this morning from authorities in San Antonio, Texas. They contacted us to verify information regarding your husband." Charlotte froze. Texas? Simon had no connection to Texas. Her pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed for detachment, the clinical composure of a doctor facing bad news. But beneath that calm, something wild stirred, dread and fragile hope colliding. "They found something," Rutherford continued, hesitating as though searching for the right words. The silence stretched, unbearable. "They found your husband's hospital ID card." Charlotte's breath caught. His ID? After all these years? It was as if a piece of Simon had surfaced from the depths. Real, tangible, horrifyingly intimate. She waited for the next words, the words that would finally end it. "It was found with his remains." But Rutherford didn't say that. Instead, his gaze faltered, and what came next made the world tilt off its axis. "It was found during an emergency surgery," he said quietly, "inside a patient." For a heartbeat, Charlotte didn't understand. The words didn't connect. Inside a patient. Then, comprehension struck, sharp and impossible. Simon hadn't died 5 years ago. He'd lived long enough to perform surgery, long enough to leave behind this message, this warning, hidden in human flesh. The room blurred. Every memory, every unanswered question came rushing back. Where had he been? Why had he disappeared? And what could possibly drive him to do something so grotesque, so deliberate? The sanctuary she'd built for herself collapsed in an instant, replaced by a hollow fear that clawed at her chest. Within hours, Charlotte was on a flight bound for San Antonio, her mind trapped in an endless loop of those 3 unbearable words. Inside a patient. The flight was a blur, a cage of recycled air, humming engines, and thoughts too loud to silence. Simon was a perfectionist, a man who double-checked every stitch and instrument. He would never leave something inside a patient by mistake. That meant it wasn't an error. It was a message, a cry for help. When the plane doors opened, the Texas heat hit her like a wall. Thick, heavy, unrelenting. The air felt foreign, hostile, a world away from the crisp New England autumn she had left behind. Waiting by the gate stood a tall man in a Stetson hat, his stance straight and shoulders squared. The lines on his face told a story of long hours and harder truths. "Dr. Alcott," he said, extending a hand, his drawl deep and measured. "I'm Texas Ranger Elias Vance. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Charlotte nodded, her voice caught somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief. "I need to see it," she managed to whisper. Vance's eyes softened slightly, but his tone stayed professional. "We'll take you there. I know this isn't easy." They rode in silence through the sprawling city, the highways glowing in the late morning sun. The hospital loomed ahead, a fortress of glass and steel, clinical and cold. Inside, the air conditioning blasted hard against the Texas humidity, but it did little to dull the rising dread in her chest. Vance led her down a sterile corridor to a small, windowless conference room. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and bureaucracy. On the table, sealed inside a clear evidence bag, lay a single plastic ID card, worn, blood-stained, familiar. Her husband's face smiled up at her through the laminate. Charlotte's knees weakened. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table as she steadied herself. The room seemed to fade away. Simon was here, not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as a mystery that refused to stay buried. On the table sat a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside it, the ID card. Charlotte reached for it, her hand trembling. She recognized it instantly. The photo. Simon, smiling, eyes crinkled behind his, glasses. The Concord Hospital logo gleaming on the familiar blue background. But something was wrong. This ID looked new, pristine, untouched by time. "This wasn't his primary badge," she murmured, her voice hollow. The realization struck like lightning. He kept a spare. Vance's brow furrowed, intrigued. "A spare?" "In the lining of his travel briefcase," Charlotte said. The memory resurfaced with painful clarity. "A hidden pocket. He showed it to me years ago. He was paranoid about losing his main ID when traveling. That briefcase had vanished along with him. Police assumed it was stolen with the car. But if this spare resurfaced now, 5 years later, it meant Simon still had it. He had planned this, waited for this." Vance nodded slowly. "That tracks. This wasn't random. It was deliberate." He led Charlotte to meet Dr. Elena Garza, the surgeon who had discovered the card. Garza looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, but her voice was steady, calm, precise, the way only another surgeon could be. "I've never seen anything like it," she began. "The patient came in with septic shock, a severe obstruction. When I operated—" Garza paused, pulling up high-resolution surgical scans on the monitor. The images filled the screen. The patient's abdomen, scar tissue thick like old rope. "It wasn't floating free," she said softly. "It was embedded near the stomach wall, lodged deliberately." Charlotte leaned closer. "Deliberate? How?" "It was placed where it wouldn't kill immediately," Garza explained. "Not blocking the bowel, not near any major vessels, just enough to cause chronic inflammation, pain that would force intervention. Eventually, inevitably." She looked up, eyes heavy with the weight of what that meant. It was a time bomb, a message, waiting to be found. The realization hit Charlotte like a blow. This wasn't a mistake. It was communication. Simon was alive, captive, desperate, and this was the only way he could reach her. He had used the only tool left to him, his own surgical skill, to carve out a message from the darkness. The relief that flooded Charlotte was quickly replaced by dread, because if he was still alive, Someone was keeping him that way. The intensive care unit hummed with mechanical life, the constant beeping of monitors, the hiss of oxygen, the sterile rhythm of machines waging war against death. In one of those beds lay Victor Ramos, barely more than a boy. His skin was pale, his breaths shallow. Every twitch of his eyes betrayed terror. From behind the glass, Charlotte and Ranger Vance watched him. "He's been resistant to questioning," Vance muttered. "Claims he doesn't remember the surgery. Says it's all a blur." Charlotte's gaze stayed fixed on the boy. Not with suspicion, but with dawning horror. Because if Victor really didn't remember, then maybe the person who put that card inside him had made sure of it. "He's scared," Charlotte murmured, her eyes lifting to the heart monitor above Victor's bed. The jagged peaks and valleys flickered across the screen, each beat telling a story of panic and pain that his silence couldn't hide. "Heart rate's elevated, blood pressure unstable," she noted quietly. "He's in a state of hyperarousal." When they stepped into the room, the tension shifted instantly. The hiss of oxygen, the sterile hum of machines, and then Victor's wide, terrified eyes. He flinched at the sight of Vance's badge, shrinking against the pillows, the tug of IV lines drawing a sharp wince. "Victor," Vance began, his tone measured, calm but unyielding. "I'm Ranger Vance. This is Dr. Alcott. We need to ask you some questions about your surgery." Victor's head shook violently. "I told the other cops. I don't know anything. I don't remember." Vance stayed steady. "You were found near the border, right? Your friend said they took you to a clinic. A humanitarian clinic?" Victor's gaze darted to the ceiling, avoiding them. "Yeah," he muttered. "They help people. I was bleeding bad." "What kind of injury?" Vance pressed. "Gunshot? Knife wound?" "I don't know. My stomach. It hurt." "And the surgery?" Vance's voice tightened. "Who performed it? Where was this clinic? We need a name, Victor. A location." Victor's pulse spiked on the monitor, his voice breaking. "They drugged me. I was out. I swear, I don't remember anything." Charlotte studied him, the shallow breaths, the trembling hands, the sweat collecting at his temples. He wasn't lying, at least not entirely. He was terrified, protecting himself, or someone else. "Victor," Charlotte said softly, stepping closer. Her tone was gentle, disarming, a balm after Vance's interrogation. "I know you're scared, but the surgeon who operated on you, he's my husband, Simon." Victor blinked, confusion cutting through his panic. "He's been missing for 5 years, Charlotte continued. "He left something inside you, his hospital ID. It wasn't an accident. It was a message." The words hit Victor like a physical blow. His breath caught, disbelief flooding his face. "Your husband?" he whispered. He did this to me?" "He did it to survive," Charlotte said, her voice breaking. "Maybe even to save you. But we need to find him. Please, Victor. Who has him?" Tears welled in Victor's eyes, his hands clutching at the sheets. "I can't," he choked out. "You don't understand. They'll kill me. They'll kill my family." He looked up, desperation blazing in his eyes. "They're everywhere." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. This wasn't fear of local criminals or corrupt doctors. This was cartel fear, the kind that seeps into your bones. Vance's expression softened. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "We can protect you, Victor. You and your family. But you have to help us. Now." Victor's gaze flickered between them. The lawman and the grieving wife, torn between terror and conscience. And then, for just a second, something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. Regret. He whispered, barely audible. "It wasn't a clinic." "You have to give us something to work with," Vance urged, his voice hardening. Victor's eyes filled with despair. "You can't protect me from them," he whispered. "Nobody can." The words hung in the sterile air like a death sentence. When they left the room, silence followed them out. Heavy, suffocating. Vance exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Damn it! He knows something. He's just too scared to talk. Charlotte nodded, the image of Victor's tear-streaked face burning behind her eyes. Whoever these people are, she said quietly, they own him. The kind of fear he has, it's not of dying, it's of living long enough for them to find him. Vance turned away, barking orders to his team. They began combing through Victor's background, a history of petty smuggling, border runs, low-level cartel work. It explained his silence. Men like Victor didn't talk, not if they wanted to keep their families alive. While Vance pursued the criminal trail, Charlotte followed the medical one. If Victor won't tell us where the surgery took place, she said, maybe his body will. Her voice had changed, the grief momentarily buried beneath the calm authority of a physician. I need his full medical records, she told Vance. The CT scans, the surgical notes, everything. I need to see exactly what Simon did to him, because beneath every incision was intent. And she knew Simon. His hands never moved without purpose. The radiology reading room was cool and dark, the blue glow of the monitors washing over Charlotte and Dr. Garza. Victor Ramos's scans filled the screens, ghostly landscapes of flesh and bone, each frame a silent confession. The scarring is remarkable, Garza murmured, pointing to faint surgical lines. Whoever did this was a master. The suture work, it's elegant, almost artistic. Charlotte's chest tightened. That was Simon's touch, the perfectionist's precision, the quiet signature only she would recognize. It was him. They traced the incisions, mapping their way through the shadows of Victor's abdomen. Gunshot wound, he said. Garza continued, frowning. But there's no sign of it. No internal bleeding, no bullet fragmentation, no trauma. Charlotte leaned closer. Then why operate at all? Garza zoomed in, scrolling slowly through the images. The tissue disruption is controlled. The margins are clean. This was an emergency repair. Her voice faltered. Charlotte, look at this. She highlighted an empty space on the screen, a void where structure should have been. Charlotte's breath hitched. Where's his left kidney? Garza froze, her expression hardening as realization dawned. It's gone, she whispered. Completely removed. The room went silent, just the hum of the machines and Charlotte's shallow breathing. That wasn't a repair, Garza said softly, her voice cracking. It was a nephrectomy. The word hit Charlotte like a blow to the chest. Simon had taken Victor's kidney. Her husband, the man she'd once called brilliant, meticulous, kind, had performed a full organ removal under illegal, hidden conditions. But why? For money? For someone's survival? Or because he was forced to? The questions clawed at her as the blue glow flickered across her face. Simon hadn't just left a message. He had left a crime scene, and it was only the beginning. The implications were staggering. What Charlotte and Vance had uncovered wasn't just a crime, it was an industry. This wasn't a random kidnapping. It wasn't a desperate act of survival. It was organized black market organ trafficking, vast, methodical, and brutally efficient. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with horrifying precision. The wiped rental car, the lack of ransom demands, the surgical precision that only someone like Simon could achieve. They hadn't kidnapped him for money. They had kidnapped him to make money. They needed a surgeon, and they had turned a healer into a butcher. Vance's jaw tightened as Charlotte relayed the findings. That explains Victor's fear, he said grimly. Organ trafficking's a multi-billion-dollar operation. These people don't leave witnesses. They erase them. Charlotte felt her stomach twist. The thought of Simon, her Simon, being forced to perform surgeries that mutilated rather than healed made her nauseous. The psychological torment of being trapped in that moral nightmare was unimaginable. But grief was replaced by resolve. We need to find where these surgeries are happening, she said, her voice sharpening with determination. They can't harvest organs in a tent or a motel room. They need sterile conditions, surgical lighting, anesthesia machines, proper storage. This is an operation, not a shack in the desert. Vance nodded, grim understanding flashing in his eyes. And they need distribution, he added. A logistics chain. Buyers, couriers, middlemen. This is bigger than we thought. Much bigger. The case had transformed. The fear of Simon's suffering was now overshadowed by the magnitude of the evil he'd been forced to serve. The ID card wasn't just a cry for help. It was a confession. And maybe a warning. Charlotte realized something chilling. If Simon had risked hiding his ID card inside a living person, it meant he knew his time was running out. And in the world of organ trafficking, when a surgeon stopped being useful, they didn't retire. They disappeared. She had to find him, not just to save him, but to stop what he'd been forced to start. Her training took over. As an anesthesiologist, Charlotte knew exactly what was required for a professional surgical setup. A nephrectomy, especially one performed for organ harvesting, demanded strict environmental control, a steady anesthetic flow, and access to tightly regulated drugs. If we can identify what anesthetics they're using, she told Vance and the growing task force, we can trace their source. Those substances are highly restricted. You can't just pick them up at a pharmacy in Juarez. Her plan was daring. Forensic toxicology at a microscopic level. She requested chemical analysis of the fibrotic tissue that had grown around Simon's ID card. If any anesthetics or antiseptics had lingered from the original operation, they might be able to trace their chemical fingerprints back to a supplier. It was a long shot, but it was the only one they had. 2 days later, the lab results came back. Charlotte pored over the dense report, her eyes scanning through lines of chemical data until 2 words froze her in place. Desflurane. Rocuronium. She looked up sharply. This is big, she said, her voice rising with a mix of disbelief and hope. Desflurane is top tier. It's expensive, heavily regulated, and requires precision vaporizers to administer. And rocuronium, it's a hospital-grade paralytic. You don't get this kind of inventory without major institutional access. Vance leaned closer, his brow furrowed. So, what does that mean? It means, Charlotte replied, Simon isn't working out of some cartel clinic in the middle of nowhere. He's inside a fully equipped, well-funded facility, maybe even a hospital, one that operates off the books. A ghost institution, hidden in plain sight. The discovery lit a fire under the task force. Vance contacted the DEA, whose agents specialized in tracking controlled substances. Every vial of desflurane and rocuronium was serialized and logged in a federal database. If someone was diverting supply, the records would show it. Charlotte worked side by side with them, creating a detailed surgical profile, a blueprint of what Simon's captors would need to sustain their operation. Sterile rooms, anesthesia workstations, blood filtration systems, refrigerated transport units. Every piece of equipment painted a picture of precision and scale, far beyond what a criminal gang could manage alone. Somewhere out there was a facility masquerading as legitimate medicine, a phantom hospital, and deep within its walls, a brilliant surgeon was being held hostage, his hands forced to betray everything he once stood for. They began tracing the supply chain, a labyrinth of purchase orders, shipping manifests, and medical distribution logs stretching across the Southwest. It was slow, grueling work. Thousands of transactions, hundreds of suppliers, a dizzying tangle of legitimate hospitals and shadow companies. But Charlotte refused to stop. Night after night, she sat in front of the data wall, spreadsheets glowing in the dim light, coffee gone cold beside her, scanning for anything out of place. An irregular shipment here, a mislabeled distributor there. Tiny inconsistencies that, to anyone else, meant nothing. But to Charlotte, they whispered pattern. Each passing hour clawed at her nerves. Every minute Simon remained missing felt like a countdown to the moment his captors decided he was expendable. The pressure was suffocating, the fear constant. Then, a break. The DEA's forensic analysts found it buried in the noise, a bulk purchase of desflurane and rocuronium, routed through a company called Aegis Global Health. Agent Miller spread a file across the table, the glossy Aegis brochures catching the fluorescent light. "They're an international humanitarian organization," he explained, his tone heavy with skepticism. "Disaster relief, war zone field hospitals, charity missions. On paper, they're saints." Charlotte flipped through the materials. Smiling children, white-coated doctors, taglines about healing the world. But the numbers didn't heal. They bled. Aegis imported vast quantities of high-grade anesthetics, perfusion pumps, and preservation fluids, all the equipment needed for organ transport, yet reported treating shockingly few patients. "The math doesn't fit," Charlotte said quietly, the realization spreading through her like ice. "They're not healing people, they're stockpiling supplies." Vance's jaw tightened. "A humanitarian front," he said. "A perfect cover. Nobody questions the good guys." The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture that made Charlotte's stomach twist. Aegis had the means, the drugs and surgical equipment. They had the motive, profit masked as charity. And they had the opportunity, access to vulnerable populations in chaos zones where people simply vanished without trace. "They're hiding in plain sight," Charlotte whispered. "And Simon, he's in there somewhere." The evidence was still circumstantial, but it was enough to burn away any doubt. Vance leaned forward, his voice steady but fierce. "We investigate them quietly, find the facility, find who's running it, and we get Simon out." The regional office of Aegis Global Health didn't look like the headquarters of a criminal empire. It was immaculate, a sleek tower of glass and steel gleaming under the Texas sun. The lobby was flooded with natural light, walls lined with photographs of smiling children and doctors in crisis zones. The organization's logo, a stylized caduceus, wings outstretched, shone proudly behind the marble reception desk. To the world, it radiated compassion and competence. But to Charlotte, it felt too perfect. The sterile air, the careful decor, the quiet hum of efficiency. It all reminded her of the hospitals she had once trusted with her life's work. Except here, the warmth felt artificial, the smiles rehearsed. As she and Vance crossed the lobby, Charlotte felt a chill run through her. This was what evil looked like in the modern world. Clean, organized, charitable. And somewhere behind these polished walls, a good man was being forced to do terrible things. The air inside Aegis Global Health felt wrong, too still, too perfect. The smiles were rehearsed, the atmosphere carefully controlled, as if every breath had been choreographed to project calm. Charlotte could sense it, the kind of calm that hides a storm. They were there to meet the director of operations. According to the DEA, the San Antonio branch was the beating heart of Aegis's activities, the epicenter of their suspicious shipments and financial anomalies. The director met them in a gleaming conference room overlooking the skyline. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed a sweeping view of the city, a monument to wealth disguised as humanitarianism. She was striking, mid-40s, elegant, composed, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I'm Evelyn Reed," she said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Ranger Vance, Dr. Alcott. What an honor. We always cooperate with the authorities." Her smile was warm, but it didn't reach her eyes. Vance's tone was polite, but there was iron beneath it. "We're investigating the illegal distribution of controlled anesthetics in this region. Your organization has imported unusually high quantities of desflurane and rocuronium. We need to review your usage records." Ms. Reed didn't flinch. Her smile stayed perfectly in place. "Of course, transparency is the backbone of humanitarian work," she said smoothly. "We maintain a large inventory because our missions can begin anywhere, at any time. Earthquakes, wars, epidemics. We prepare for the unpredictable." She handed over a set of files, meticulous, flawless, almost too perfect. Every vial accounted for, every shipment logged, every signature in place. Charlotte studied her closely. The woman's voice carried the poise of someone used to control. Deliberate phrasing, unhurried cadence, and an undercurrent of authority. A practiced performance. "Your reports show unusually low patient numbers," Charlotte said suddenly, her tone sharp. "Yet your anesthetic usage is off the charts. How do you explain that discrepancy?" For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed Reed's face. Her smile held, but her eyes hardened. "We operate in crisis zones, Dr. Alcott," she replied evenly. "We can't always predict patient flow or field conditions. Preparedness saves lives. Surely you understand that?" Her answer was smooth. Too smooth. It was rehearsed. The kind of line built for press conferences, not truth. But something else caught Charlotte's attention. The way Reed used medical terminology, effortlessly, like muscle memory. Her phrasing was exact, her tone clinical. "You have a medical background, don't you?" Charlotte asked quietly, her gaze steady. "You're not just an administrator? You're a doctor." A brief silence followed. Reed's expression froze, just for a heartbeat, before the mask returned. "I hold a doctorate in public health," she said lightly. "It's important for my role here." But Charlotte knew. She could feel it in her bones. Reed wasn't some executive in a suit. She was a surgeon, one who'd traded her oath for profit. They left the office with perfect paperwork and zero proof. Yet Charlotte couldn't shake the stench of deception clinging to the polished air. "She's lying," Charlotte said as they stepped into the blinding Texas sun. "And she's a surgeon. I'm sure of it." "I agree," Vance said grimly. "But we can't act on instinct. We need evidence, hard evidence." "She's the one running the medical side," Charlotte said, her voice low. "She's the architect, the one who forced Simon to operate." Vance didn't respond, but the truth hung between them like a blade. They had rattled the serpent's cage, and now the serpent knew their names. The days that followed were tense. Surveillance on Aegis yielded nothing. Every move they made was covered by layers of legality and encryption. Their digital footprint was as clean as their marble lobby. The investigation was stalling, and Charlotte could feel time slipping through her fingers. One night, under the glow of city neon, she returned to the hospital to check on Victor Ramos. His condition had stabilized, but his spirit was fractured. Fear clung to him like a shadow. As Charlotte stepped into the ICU wing, something immediately felt off. The usual calm hum of machines was broken by raised voices near the nurse's station. Two men in hospital uniforms stood at Victor's door, arguing with the night nurse. A police officer stood nearby, hand resting on his holster. "We're here for a transfer," one of the men said sharply. "Victor Ramos. He's being moved to a specialized facility. Orders from administration." The nurse frowned. "There's no transfer order in the system. I can't authorize anything without the attending physician's signature." "This is an emergency," the second man snapped, thrusting a clipboard forward. The paperwork fluttered in the cold air. "We don't have time for red tape." Charlotte froze. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Emergency transfers didn't happen like this. Not at night, not without protocol. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "I'm Dr. Alcott," she said. "I oversee Mr. Ramos's care. There's been no authorization for transfer." The men turned toward her. Recognition flashed in their eyes. Cold, sharp, unmistakable. They had seen her before. At Aegis. "The order came from administration," one said, his voice tightening. Charlotte met his gaze. "Then administration can call me directly." A tense silence followed, the kind that hums right before something breaks. The police officer shifted his stance, sensing the shift in the air. Charlotte glanced at the paperwork. The letterhead was fake, the signatures sloppy. Her pulse spiked. These men weren't orderlies. They were extraction agents, sent to erase the last loose end. It looked official, the hospital's logo gleaming at the top, the authorization code matching the standard format. But the signatures, they were wrong. Too perfect, too deliberate. Charlotte felt her pulse quicken as the truth crystallized. It was a forgery. A clean, professional forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. Her stomach dropped. These weren't orderlies. They were assassins, sent to finish what Aegis had started. "This isn't a valid authorization," Charlotte said sharply, her voice slicing through the sterile corridor. "You need to leave. Now." The two men exchanged a quick glance, a silent, wordless exchange that spoke volumes. In an instant, their fake politeness vanished. Their postures shifted. The facade of professionalism cracked, revealing something raw and violent beneath. "Step aside, Doctor," the taller one growled, reaching for the handle of Victor's door, his other hand brushing the weapon holstered under his uniform. Charlotte didn't move. She squared her shoulders, blocking the doorway, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "You'll have to go through me first." The man lunged. His grip clamped around her arm like a vice, but instinct took over, years of self-defense drills kicking in. Charlotte twisted sharply, breaking free and shoving him backward with everything she had. "Security!" she shouted, slamming her palm against the red emergency alarm. A deafening siren split the air. The sterile silence of the ICU was replaced by chaos. Alarms blaring, nurses shouting, lights flashing. The assassins froze for a second, their plan unraveling before their eyes. Then, like cornered animals, they bolted, sprinting down the hall as a police officer rounded the corner with his weapon drawn. "Stop! Hands up!" the officer yelled. But the men were already gone, disappearing into the night before backup could arrive. Charlotte pressed her back against the wall, chest heaving, her hands trembling uncontrollably. It had lasted seconds, but the terror, the sheer violence of it, lingered in her bones. Vance appeared moments later, his face set in grim determination as the flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers painted ghostly shadows across the hospital walls. "They're getting sloppy," he muttered as forensic techs began their work. Charlotte shook her head, her voice still trembling but edged with steel. "No, they're panicking, and panic makes people dangerous." For the first time, the threat wasn't abstract. It was real, close, breathing down their necks. The organization had made its move, revealing just how far they'd go to protect their secret. It wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was survival. The attack in the ICU shattered what little resistance Victor had left. The illusion of safety, even inside a hospital, under police protection, was gone. His hands shook as he recounted what had happened, realizing the horrifying truth. Silence wouldn't protect him. It would bury him. By morning, he was relocated to a secure safe house deep in San Antonio's maze of quiet neighborhoods. Armed guards patrolled outside, their radios crackling in the tense stillness. Inside, the air felt heavy, claustrophobic. When Charlotte and Vance returned, Victor's face was pale and hollow. The bravado he once had was gone, replaced by a haunted awareness that the people he once worked for would rather kill him than let him speak. Charlotte sat across from him, her tone gentler now, but firm. "Victor, they tried to kill you. They won't stop until they know you're silenced for good. But if you help us, if you help me, we can end this." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, his eyes lifted, tired, broken, but ready. "All right," he whispered. "I'll talk." There was something different in Victor's eyes now, a flicker of resolve beneath the exhaustion. The fear hadn't left him. It hovered there like a shadow, but it had changed shape. It wasn't just terror anymore. It was a need to unburden himself, to finally let the truth out. "I'll talk," he whispered as Charlotte and Vance entered the room, his voice thin but steady. "I'll tell you everything. Just keep me safe." And then it came, a torrent of confession, tumbling out in fits and starts, tangled with guilt, fear, and years of suppressed shame. "I didn't sell my kidney," he began, his voice cracking. "They took it. I lost a shipment, drugs, a lot of money. I was working for a cartel, just a runner. I messed up, and they said I had to make it right." His hand trembled as he spoke, eyes fixed somewhere far away. "They took me to a clinic, said they'd patch me up, make me useful again, but they drugged me. When I woke up, my kidney was gone." Charlotte felt her stomach twist. It wasn't just about profit. It was control. The cartel wasn't just selling organs. They were using them as weapons, as messages, power through pain. "It was punishment," Victor continued, his voice hollow. "They wanted everyone to know what happens when you cross them. You don't just lose money, you lose a part of yourself." "Where was this clinic?" Vance asked urgently, leaning forward. "Where did they take you?" Victor shook his head, frustration tightening his jaw. "I don't know. They blindfolded me, put a hood over my head. It was a long drive, hours. The road was rough, the air dry, desert air. Then," he hesitated, searching through foggy fragments of memory. "A plane, a small one, propeller engine. We flew maybe an hour, maybe less." Charlotte exchanged a glance with Vance. That single detail changed everything. A flight meant distance, a remote, hidden facility, the kind that could vanish from maps, far from prying eyes. "What did it look like?" Charlotte asked gently. "Anything you remember? The inside, the people?" Victor's voice grew quiet, as if the memory itself hurt. "Sterile, too clean, bright lights, machines everywhere, like a real hospital. But it was silent, wrong kind of silence. There were guards, a lot of them, military-type weapons." He swallowed hard. "And the surgeon, he was American, older, gray hair, glasses. He looked dead inside, just empty." Charlotte froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Simon. The description fit him perfectly. Her husband, her missing husband. The man who vanished 5 years ago. Her throat tightened as Victor continued, unaware of the dagger twisting in her chest. "The woman was the one in charge," he said. "I saw her giving orders. Calm, confident. The men called her La Doctora." Charlotte leaned in, every nerve in her body on edge. "Who was she, Victor? Did you recognize her?" Victor nodded slowly, dread creeping back into his eyes. "It was her. The woman from Aegis. The director, Miss Reed." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Charlotte's breath caught. The truth hit her like an electric shock. Evelyn Reed, the polished, philanthropic face of Aegis Global Health, was the mastermind. Vance spoke quietly, the weight of realization settling over him. "Did you hear her full name?" Victor hesitated, then whispered, "They called her Taus, Maria Taus." Charlotte felt the room tilt slightly. Evelyn Reed wasn't even her real name. "Maria Taus," she repeated softly, the name rolling off her tongue like poison. They finally had it. A name, a face, a facility hidden deep in the desert. The mask had cracked, and the monster beneath was finally visible. The abstract fear that had haunted Charlotte for months was gone, replaced by something sharper, a tangible enemy with a name. Maria Torres. The name felt poisonous on her tongue, but it also gave her purpose. For the first time, the monster had a face. And now, Charlotte had a target. The search for Simon had entered its final, most dangerous phase. Within hours of the revelation, Vance activated the full might of the task force. The command center buzzed with controlled chaos. Agents from the FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security working in tight coordination. Screens glowed with data streams, satellite feeds, and encrypted files. The name La Doctora, once whispered in fear, now pulsed at the center of every briefing. "Let's peel her apart," Vance ordered, his voice steady but edged with anger. The analysts went deep, unearthing fragments of a life Maria Torres had tried to erase. What they found was chilling. She wasn't just an administrator or a facilitator. She was once brilliant. A top-tier surgeon, trained at Johns Hopkins, specializing in transplant surgery. A prodigy with hands steady enough to save lives, and later, destroy them. But brilliance had turned to arrogance, and arrogance to corruption. A decade ago, Torres had been accused of black market transplant deals, falsifying donor records, and running unauthorized experiments on patients in Mexico and Central America. Her license had been stripped, her reputation obliterated. Most believed she'd fled overseas, swallowed by the chaos of cartel territories. They were wrong. She never left, Vance said grimly, standing before the glowing task force screen. She just changed her name. Evelyn Reed, Maria Torres. It's the same woman. She's been here the whole time, building her empire under our noses. The evidence was damning. Using her alias, Torres had turned Aegis Global Health into the perfect front. Humanitarian missions masking a global organ trafficking network. She had the medical knowledge, the logistics infrastructure, and the moral void to make it work. And Simon? He was her prize catch, a brilliant surgeon, kidnapped and forced into her dark operation. The task force moved fast. Aegis facilities across Texas were put under surveillance. Drones tracked supply convoys heading into the desert. Every intercepted signal was another piece of the puzzle. Then, the breakthrough. A cyber unit intercepted a cluster of encrypted messages from Torres's network. The tone was urgent, the language clinical, but cold. "They're talking about liquidating assets," the lead FBI analyst reported. His words cut through the noise of the room. "They're shutting down, burning everything. Evidence, witnesses, the compound." Vance's gut clenched. "And Simon?" The analyst hesitated, then read from the decrypted text. "They're calling him unstable, a liability. They've got a replacement in training. They're planning to dispose of him." The word dispose hit the room like a gunshot. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. Her world narrowed to one thought. Simon is still alive, but not for long. Everything that had happened, Victor's confession, the attempted hit, the chase through the shadows, had led to this moment. The clock was ticking, and they had only hours before Torres erased everything. "The desert?" Charlotte whispered. "That's where it is. Victor said they flew into the desert." Vance nodded. "Chihuahuan region. We've got aerial scans, but nothing definitive. It's isolated. They built it to vanish." Then came the order that would set everything into motion. "Mobilize tactical," Vance commanded. "All units, we move tonight." As dawn broke over the endless sprawl of the Chihuahuan desert, the strike teams assembled. Black SUVs and armored vehicles lined up like silent predators beneath a blood-red sky. The air was dry, electric, humming with tension. Somewhere out there, hidden beneath sand and rock, was the facility where Simon was being held. This was no longer an investigation. It was a rescue, and the endgame had begun. The task of finding a hidden compound in the vastness of the Chihuahuan desert felt impossible, like chasing a ghost across a sea of sand. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a scorched, silent expanse of rock and wind that could swallow entire towns without a trace. But for Charlotte and the task force, that's exactly where the answers lay. Somewhere out there, beneath the unyielding sun, was Simon, and the nightmare facility that had enslaved him. They began where all impossible searches begin, with fragments, Victor's broken memories, intercepted transmissions, old flight data, and the faint digital fingerprints buried in the supply chain records. A coalition of Texas Rangers, FBI agents, and DEA analysts had established a makeshift command post on the edge of San Antonio, the last breath of civilization before the desert swallowed everything. Inside the tent, the air buzzed with tension and the low hum of generators. Portable monitors flickered with satellite imagery and topographic maps, their pale light washing over the faces of agents who hadn't slept in days. Charlotte stood at the center, her eyes locked on a sprawling map pinned to the wall. Every red pin was a dead lead, every line another theory. The desert looked endless, indifferent, but she refused to believe it was impenetrable. He said they drove for hours, then flew for about one, Agent Miller said, his voice low but steady as he drew a radius around a massive section of southern Texas. That gives us roughly 200 miles of search radius. That's half the desert, Vance muttered, running a hand through his hair. We could spend months out there. Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Her mind was already working, reconstructing the problem not as a detective, but as a doctor. They're performing surgeries, she said finally, her tone calm but resolute. That means infrastructure, power, sterile water, temperature control. You can't do that in a shack or a cave. The environment itself leaves clues. She began circling areas on the map. They'd need electricity, lots of it, for anesthesia machines, lighting, and refrigeration units. If they're off-grid, they'll need backup generators, and those require fuel. Diesel deliveries, Vance said, catching on. Someone's moving fuel into the desert, regularly. Exactly, Charlotte continued. And water. You can't sterilize instruments or maintain patients without a reliable source. They'd have to drill into an aquifer or tap a natural spring. Agent Miller frowned. There's barely any groundwater in this region, only a few known aquifers. Small ones, hard to access. Then that's where we start, Charlotte said, her eyes hard with determination. The analysts moved quickly, overlaying geological surveys with energy grid data, mapping aquifer locations against recorded fuel shipments. Slowly, the digital chaos began to take shape. Areas that once looked infinite started to shrink. Every few minutes, someone eliminated a false lead. Another cluster of coordinates vanished from the board. The tension in the room thickened as the map grew cleaner, narrower, sharper. Then, one image stopped everyone cold. Agent Miller zoomed in on a grainy satellite photograph of an isolated canyon system near the Texas-Mexico border. The terrain was jagged and brutal. Sheer cliffs, narrow passes, and deep shadows that swallowed light even at midday. But buried within that maze of rock was something unnatural. There, he said, pointing to a faint geometric outline barely visible against the sand. Thermal anomalies, consistent heat signatures, too regular to be geological. Could be generators, or a facility. Charlotte leaned in, her pulse quickening. And there's a reflective array, possibly solar panels. Vance exhaled slowly. A perfect setup, isolated, powered, and off every official grid. The room went silent for a moment. The hum of the machines seemed to fade beneath the weight of realization. After weeks of chasing ghosts, they had finally found something solid. Charlotte stared at the image, her throat tight. "That's it," she whispered. "That's where they're keeping him." Vance nodded, already reaching for the radio. "All right, let's gear up. We move before nightfall." Outside, the desert wind picked up, scattering dust across the horizon. The final hunt had begun, and somewhere out there, beneath the same burning sky, Simon was waiting. Charlotte's words landed like a thrown gauntlet. For the first time since the case began, the investigation had become a rescue, and she refused to be a spectator. Vance held her gaze for a long beat, the desert light slicing across his face. He had the authority to deny her. He also knew the calculus of risk. A surgical compound changed everything. Volatile anesthetics, pressurized oxygen, cryogenic storage, patients on drips. An assault without a medic who understood those dangers could turn a rescue into a massacre. He saw the logic in her plea, and something harder, the fierce, furious human insistence that wouldn't be bargained away. "All right," he said at last, voice low, measured. "You can come, on 2 conditions." She nodded before he finished. "No heroics. You follow HRT's chain of command. You stay with the med team at all times. If it's too hot, you get pulled. Understood?" "Understood," Charlotte answered. The relief and terror braided into one steady resolve. They moved fast. The forward operating base turned into a hive of final checks. Med packs laid out like surgical trays, anesthesia carts double-checked, portable vaporizers inventoried, and oxygen cylinders staged with locking brackets. Charlotte worked with the tactical medics, translating her hospital routine into field-ready protocols: how to triage multiple patients under fire, how to render emergency anesthesia with limited monitoring, how to isolate and safely handle residual volatile agents so they didn't create a secondary hazard for assault teams. She briefed the HRT physicians on a dozen technical points Vance's tactical brief didn't cover: desfloran's flammability risk in an oxygen-rich environment, the need to secure vaporizers before engaging compressors, how muscle relaxants like rocuronium could mask a captive's ability to cry out, and the imperative of rapid vascular access for blood loss control. Her voice was calm and clinical, the kind of clarity that cut through adrenaline. "Remember," she said, laying a schematic of the compound's interior across the table: the operating suite, the storage vaults, the patient ward. If they've been conducting nephrectomies and organ preservation, they'll have cold storage and perfusion pumps. That means compressed gases, backup generators, and refrigeration lines. If we breach and those systems fail, we risk immediate patient collapse. Our objective is rescue first, seize second. HRT's captain, a man with a cropped haircut and tired eyes, nodded. "We'll move fast and clean. Your med team will be staged at point 2. We clear rooms in 10-minute windows. You have authority to halt an entry if it's a mass casualty situation." The insertion plan balanced speed with surgical caution. At dusk, under a moon that made the canyon edges ghostly, stealth helicopters lifted off. 2 assault elements would fast rope to rim positions and isolate the compound. A ground convoy would secure the access road. A med-evac vehicle would ride just behind the breach teams, its lights masked until the blue strobe would be needed to mark extraction. Charlotte rode in the Medbird, strapped into a crash-worthy seat, her kit a compact hospital on her lap. Induction drugs, advanced airway tools, portable monitors, and a small vaporizer housing she'd insisted they bring. The flight was a taut, silent thread through velvet dark. The canyon dropped away beneath them like a black wound. On the screens, the compound's thermal glow pulsed, generators humming like mechanical hearts. As they neared, Charlotte felt the old operating room choreography take hold. Methodical breathing, counting, steady hands. Fear thinned into focus. They landed on a narrow ledge under the rotor wash, booted men vanishing into the rock shadows. The sound of the assault was immediate, controlled and shocking. Radio calls clipped. The thud of suppressed rounds, team leaders checking status back to the fob. Charlotte and 2 combat medics raced down a scrub-choked path toward the jagged outline of the compound, the lights of flashbangs momentarily turning night into sterile day. They hit the perimeter almost simultaneously with the breach team. Gas canisters hissed, the tactical breach gave way, and then a corridor. It smelled faintly of antiseptic under something sour and chemical. Farther in, a fluorescent glare lit a bank of refrigeration units. In one of the rooms, an operating lamp still swung gently from its mount, the weight of its bulb damped by the aftershocks of the assault. Monitors blinked in standby. "Med team clear," came a voice. Charlotte's training unhooked the emotional tremor and slid immediately into triage logic. She swept the room with practiced eyes, restrained patients on cots, tubing looped into IV poles, oxygen masks slung to the side. In the corner, strapped to a cot and guarded by a stunned tech who had been overrun, was a man with gaunt features and iron-gray hair, eyes hooded but open. Simon. The sight stole her breath. He looked older than his years, thinner but alive. A ragged line of stubble, a hospital gown patched and stained, the pale halo of a monitor reflecting in his eyes. They met across a gulf of impossible time. He didn't speak at first. His jaw worked as if reassembling a language. Charlotte moved to him, knees steady despite the adrenaline. She checked his airway, his pulses. life checks that felt in that instant like prayers. His pulse was thin but present. His pupils tracked her. He recognized her. "Charlotte," he croaked, voice raw, disbelief and relief bleeding together. She straightened, a hot, inward ache blooming. "Simon," she breathed. There were words she'd rehearsed for months, speeches she'd never have to give. Instead, she simply reached for his hand. Behind them, the breach continued. Voices barked, doors were kicked, and somewhere deeper in the compound, a voice barked orders in Spanish that cut like a blade. Charlotte's mind cataloged the scene, the wounded, the running teams, the ticking hazard of anesthetic vaporizers primed and still connected. Every second was precarious. Every decision had consequences. A tactical medic stepped closer, raising a gloved hand. "We're setting up a forward triage," he said. "We'll get him stable. Airway, warm him, start fluids." "How's his airway?" Charlotte already had a plan. "Protect the airway. I need a working ventilator and a line. Prepare warmed fluids. Check for perfusion cannulas. He may have been used for organ perfusion. Do not remove anything unless it's endangering him." Simon's eyes never left her face for a sliver of time, amid the sirens and the shouted commands and the echo of boots on concrete. The world narrowed to two people who had been split by 5 years of darkness and were, by sheer force of will, being pulled back together. The assault was not over. Maria Torres's men were still fighting, rooms were still being cleared, and the command chain buzzed with urgent updates. But for the first time since his disappearance, Simon had a hand to squeeze, a tether back to the life that had been stolen from him. Charlotte felt the enormity of what lay ahead, stabilizing patients in a volatile environment, securing forensic evidence, and confronting the woman who had turned medicine into a weapon. She also felt a fiercer truth burning under the fear. Rescue had begun, and nothing would stop her from seeing it through. The sound hit like a physical blow. In the dim light of the forward operating base, Charlotte froze, her breath caught mid-inhale, eyes locked on the thermal monitors that suddenly flared with movement. The calm precision that had filled the air seconds ago shattered into chaos. Voices erupted over the radio, clipped, controlled, but edged with urgency. "Alarm triggered. We're compromised. Go to breach plan Delta." Vance's voice cut through the noise, calm but razor-sharp. "All units, proceed to contingency protocol. Maintain cover. Move fast." Charlotte's pulse thundered in her ears. She watched the ghostly green silhouettes on the drone feed scatter, each one an agent now sprinting for new cover positions. The quiet rhythm of the operation, the steady, methodical approach, was gone. In its place came the staccato burst of gunfire, echoing faintly through the open channel. "Contact! Multiple hostiles! Repeat, multiple hostiles! Inside the compound!" The words sent a tremor through her chest. This was no longer a surgical rescue. It was turning into a battlefield. She clenched her fists, the Kevlar vest pressing against her ribs as she leaned closer to the screen. On one monitor, she saw muzzle flashes flare like lightning against the canyon walls. Another camera caught agents sweeping across the perimeter, ducking behind low rock outcroppings as return fire raked the sand. "Get those drones repositioned," Vance ordered. "I want eyes on the southern sector." Charlotte forced herself to focus, to think. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Somewhere in that labyrinth of gunfire and flashing heat signatures was Simon. Every second the firefight dragged on meant a greater chance he'd be caught in the crossfire, or silenced before rescue could reach him. The tactical medic beside her adjusted his headset. "We've got wounded coming in," he said grimly. 2 operators down, 1 critical. Charlotte's instincts kicked in. "Prep a trauma bay, IV lines, oxygen ready, and epi standing by," she said, her voice steady, the doctor overtaking the fear. She moved to the rear compartment where the medics were setting up a makeshift triage station. Folding stretchers, sealed med kits, IV bags swinging from improvised hooks. The smell of antiseptic fought a losing battle against the diesel and sweat. Outside, the night burned with distant flashes. The radio hissed again. "Alpha team is inside. Multiple tangos down. We're pushing toward the central structure." Charlotte turned back to the monitor feed, her pulse quickening. The image on screen showed the agents breaching a reinforced door, their movements a blur of precision under fire. Then, the camera panned, revealing a cold, sterile corridor lined with stainless steel equipment. Her breath caught. She knew that look. The surgical wing. "That's it," she whispered. "That's where he is." Vance stepped up beside her, his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the same feed. "Then that's where we're going to finish this." For a moment, the noise around them faded. The chatter, the beeps, the gunfire, all drowned beneath the heavy realization that the final stage had begun. Charlotte felt the knot in her chest tighten, her thoughts circling the same desperate hope. Simon was in there, somewhere behind those steel doors, trapped in the nightmare they'd spent years trying to unravel. She adjusted her headset and glanced at Vance. "If they find him, if he's alive, I need to be ready to move." "You'll get the call," he said quietly. "Be ready." She nodded, forcing herself to breathe evenly as she turned back to the screens. The firefight had shifted inside the compound, the drone's thermal feed now showing shapes moving down narrow halls. The mission was no longer about strategy or vengeance. It had distilled to something raw and simple. Get Simon out, alive. And for the first time since the alarm had sounded, Charlotte allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they still could. The bunker hatch blew cleanly, a thunderclap that shredded the canyon's fragile quiet and kicked up a cloud of dust that glittered in the floodlights. For a second, the world was only sound and motion. Boots, shouts, the metallic grind of teams pouring down the ladder into black concrete. Then, the fog of war snapped into surgical clarity as HRT operators methodically cleared the descending corridors, their suppressed calls precise and steady. Charlotte watched the feed, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The medics staged at the entrance readied stretchers and warming blankets. Time had narrowed to this corridor, this stairwell, this one brittle hinge between life and death. They moved fast, room to room, door to door. And what they found under the desert was worse than any of the satellite images had suggested. A small labyrinth of sterile halls branched off from a central suite, an operating theater rigged with hospital-grade lights, perfusion pumps lined like sentries, refrigeration units, humming in a locked alcove, and rows of cots where gaunt bodies lay hooked to IVs and monitors. The air smelled of antiseptic and something older, metallic and sour. Evidence tags fluttered on trays, handwritten logs, shipping manifests, patient charts. The paper trail the task force had been hunting for years sat on a stainless cart. And then they saw him. On a narrow cot in the operating bay, his wrists bound but not beaten, a thin man with gray hair and a hospital gown. Simon lifted his head when Charlotte's voice came over the radio and then through the doorway. For a moment his eyes were blank. Then recognition struck, a slow, unbearable bloom of bewildered joy. He tried to speak. The word was ragged and small. "Charlotte." She was moving before the medics could get to him, sliding down into the operating room on knees that had gone suddenly rubbery. She checked his airway, felt his pulse, cataloged the obvious in a heartbeat. Dehydration, malnutrition, surgical scars, healed and reopened in places, but still. A pulse, a response. Pupils that tracked. He was alive. Around them, the building erupted into controlled chaos. Operators secured the refrigeration vault. Too many chilled units. Coolers packed with labeled organ cassettes and preservation fluid. Each tag a piece of evidence that would gin up a cascade of indictments. Forensics swarmed. Photographers captured every sterile surface. Techs bagged hard drives. The medics worked in parallel. Warm fluids, airway support, IV access, rapid labs. Charlotte barked orders, her voice snapping into the crisp cadence it had at the OR. Triage, stabilization, move to evac. They found survivors, frightened, hollow, some already too far gone. And they found the surgeon's station. Charts that linked patients to transfers, and ledger pages that pointed straight back to Aegis. Coded entries, donor IDs that had no legitimate registry, invoices paid into shell accounts. It was everything. The how, the who, the proof. Then the call that cut the room was brief and electric. Movement, upper corridor, hostile female target attempting egress. The camera panned. A door at the far end burst as someone tried to run the ventilation shaft into the service access. For a heartbeat, Charlotte thought of a desperate doctor, a woman fleeing capture. Then the figure turned, rain-slick hair plastered to her face, and Charlotte saw the eyes she already knew. Cold, precise, unrepentant. Maria Torres moved like a viper. 2 HRT operators boxed her in at the shaft mouth. She fought, clawing, striking, spit and rage, and the stench of fear on her breath. She snarled in English and clipped Spanish, a mix of derision and calculation. "You think this is over?" she hissed as they cuffed her. "You have no idea what infrastructure you've probed." But she was bound and subdued within a minute. Vance appeared in the doorway as Torres was dragged toward him, boots scuffing the tile. "You're under arrest," Vance said, voice low but steady. He looked exhausted, older in that instant, every fiber tuned to the job and the moment. Torres lifted her chin, unbowed. "Do your worst," she spat. "There are others. You don't have enough." They led her past the operating suite where Simon lay watching, his fingers flexing as if remembering sutures and scalpels. Charlotte slipped her hand into his, the contact small and fierce. He squeezed back, a thin, incredulous smile, ghosting his face before pain made it still again. "Don't," he croaked. "Don't take her. Tell them everything." He sounded like someone who had given up on illusions and only wanted truth to matter now. The medics prepped Simon for evacuation. They had him warm and on a secure stretcher within minutes, running lines, bolstering blood pressure, and when the medevac bird touched down, Charlotte rode with him to the field hospital that had been readied at the FAB. In the helicopter's churn, his hand was surprisingly warm. She held it until the rotors took them into a sky that felt less like a vault and more like a promise. In the days that followed, the compound's horror unfolded like a sealed dossier being read aloud. Forensics cataloged organ cassettes, patient IDs, wire transfers, and flight manifests. Aegis's glossy brochures were shredded into evidence. Maria Torres's alias whirled down into formal identity charts. The public unraveling was swift and devastating. Indictments unrolled across jurisdictions. Aegis's accounts were frozen, and arrests ranged from surgeons cum brokers to logistics operatives who'd run flights and refrigerated convoys into the desert. At the field hospital, Simon's recovery was a slow, merciless arithmetic of small victories, electrolytes corrected, infections tamped down, muscles regaining the tremulous strength to squeeze Charlotte's hand. He was guarded by grief and guilt, not only for the things he'd been forced to do, but for what being alive had cost others. He apologized with the clumsy, quiet sorrow of a man trying to reconcile an unlit moral geography. "You were taken," Charlotte told him over and over, when he could listen. Simple facts she knew he hadn't chosen. "You were forced. We will prove it." Legal teams worked as the medical ones did. Fast, forensic, methodical. Prosecutors built the case from paper and blood and plug-and-play ledger lines. Victor and other survivors testified. Vance, stone-faced in court, delivered a simple narrative. They'd found a bunker, a network, a woman with a surgeon's hands who'd turned healing into trade. Maria Torres, alias Evelyn Reed, was indicted on a series of charges that read like a criminal novel: kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit organ harvesting, multiple counts of assault and attempted murder. and a forest of regulatory violations and falsified records. She sat in court with the same precise composure she'd shown at the Aegis office, but the cameras found frustration at the edges of her mouth as witnesses described corridors and lists and the cold efficiency of the operation. The trials lasted months. Depositions turned into dull, searing testimony. Nurses and technicians who'd been coerced, pilots who'd flown night routes, cash trails that tracked through offshore accounts. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdicts were decisive. Maria Torres and several high-ranking associates faced decades behind bars. Aegis Global Health collapsed under the weight of legal action, its humanitarian missions exposed as a fraud so vast it stunned international partners. Relief efforts that were legitimate scrambled to distance themselves and redouble oversight. But the legal closure did not erase the damage. For the survivors, recovery was a long, jagged road. Victor entered witness protection, and his face was shielded from cameras, but the look in his eyes at the hearing, exhaustion and a memorialized terror, stayed with Charlotte. Simon's hands would never be exactly what they once were. The muscle memory of a surgeon slowly returned, but under a new roof. Therapy, accountability, and a long period of being declared fit to practice only under strict oversight. The medical boards reconstituted themselves against the loopholes the case had exposed. New regulatory teeth were legislated into place to track anesthetic distribution and transplant logistics. For Charlotte, the rescue was personal and paradoxical. The relief of finding Simon alive was tethered to grief over what he had been forced to do, and for those who had been stolen from. She testified, calm and exact, about the layout of the bunker, the anesthetic signatures, the clinical evidence that had linked the crimes to Torres's methods. Her testimony helped convict the network. It also helped launch systemic reforms. In the quiet months after arrests, she and Simon learned to inhabit a new life stitched together from fragile threads. Hospital shifts that were shorter, therapy sessions that were raw and honest, and slow afternoons of rebuilding trust. He would never forget the bunker lights or the sterile smell of things taken and sold. Neither would she forget the weight of the vest or the smell of dust after the breach. But between them, there was a stubborn kind of healing, not the cinematic all is well ending, but a truer arc. Patient, incomplete, human. The story made headlines. Commissions and inquiries followed. Charities tightened scrutiny. And somewhere beyond the courtroom and the command center, the desert reclaimed its quiet. The bunker's concrete skeleton was sealed and carted away as evidence. Families got answers. People who had been erased found names again. Charlotte walked the corridors of her hospital months later and sometimes paused by the pediatric operating suite where she'd first learned to find balance in chaos. The machines hummed. Children's laughter leaked out of a recovery room. It was ordinary and sacred. She would never be the same, neither would Simon, but they had been stitched back to the world by the stubborn insistence of those who refused to let the buried be forgotten. The case closed with convictions, reforms, and the slow, continuing work of survivors learning to breathe without fear. The headlines faded, as headlines do, but the changes endured. Tighter medical supply chains, international arrests, and a new vigilance against the kind of camouflage that turns charity into a crime. Charlotte kept a small photo on her desk, not of victory, but of a moment in the field hospital when Simon's fingers found hers, and a small, shaky smile passed between them. It was a quiet talisman, proof that even in the worst of nights, you could still find someone to hold on to. A live feed snapped suddenly into focus on one of the fob monitors. Grainy, high contrast, the kind of image that turns your skin cold. The camera was inside the bunker's operating suite. Ceiling lights washed the room in clinical white. Stainless steel gleamed, and everything looked eerily calm. In the center of the theater, a patient lay prepped under drapes, tubing and lines snaking into IV poles and machines. And standing over the table, working with mechanical precision despite the hollow look in his face, was Simon. 5 years collapsed into that single, impossible frame. Gaunt, gray at the temples, hands still steadied by muscle memory, eyes empty, but moving with the clinical rhythm of incision and suture. At his temple, Maria Torres rested the cold barrel of a handgun like an executioner's metronome. Guards filled the shadows beyond the lights, rifles trained and faces unreadable. Torres's voice came over the hacked frequency, calm, razor-sharp, and designed to terrorize. "Do not breach," she said, every syllable measured. "Any attempt to enter will end the patient and Dr. Alcott immediately." The ultimatum landed in the fob like ice. The breach team stopped within arm's reach of the hatch. The charges sat untouched. The tactical assault transformed in an instant into a frozen standoff. Vance took the radio and negotiated with the steady cadence of a man who'd spent years keeping others alive by buying time. He spoke to Torres as both adversary and human being, offering surrender and safety in exchange for lives spared. Torres answered not with mercy, but with calculation. The organ on that table, she said, belonged to a buyer who'd already paid. A mission-critical transplant, she insisted, and she would not let money be lost. The mix of greed and calm sociopathy in her voice made the room ache. While Vance traded words, Charlotte did what she always does under pressure. She looked at the machines. On the screen, she watched tiny numbers blink in the corner. Respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, the slow, telltale drop of a pressure trace. She noted the vaporizer rig beside the anesthesia cart, the IV bolus line taped to a perfusion pump, and a long, insulated refrigeration conduit leading from the OR out through a service hatch, a sign that organs were being moved under active cold storage. Her clinical mind translated those images into options and vulnerabilities. A few critical details leapt out. The anesthesia setup used desflurane via a precision vaporizer, volatile and flammable in oxygen-rich environments. And the ventilator's external compressors appeared tied to the compound's separate generator bank. The perfusion pumps were on a looped power feed, likely with an independent UPS. If the team could interrupt the power to the refrigeration and perfusion systems without disrupting the ventilator or cutting life support lines, they could create leverage, force Torres into a decision that didn't involve killing a patient or a captive surgeon. It was a narrow, dangerous window, but it was a window. Charlotte relayed the observations to Vance in clipped, clinical phrases. "They've got independent power for perfusion and refrigeration, desflurane in use. If we cut the non-life support feed to the perfusion and cold chain, we risk organ loss, which might force them to reconsider execution. But we must simultaneously maintain ventilator support for the patient and Dr. Alcott. We need a surgical med team ready to assume ventilation and immediate perfusion care the moment we hit that feed." Silence fell as the tactical and medical minds in the FOB folded Charlotte's assessment into the options board. The standoff had become a chess match where every move could mean life or death. Outside, the desert pressed in like a closed fist. Inside, the clock ticked. Vance's reply was the softest thing she'd heard from him that night. "Do it, but only on my call. We move precisely and together." The negotiation resumed, now with a new layer. Words, threats, and a fragile, desperate plan based on the brittle technical realities of an operating room. Charlotte watched the live feed with her hands clenched, every clinician instinct straining toward the same impossible hope: to keep Simon alive, to save the patient on the table, and to force the woman who had weaponized medicine into a choice she could not control. "Would you like me to continue with the next scene? The decisive move Vance orders and Charlotte's role as the med team springs into action during the standoff?" Charlotte's voice was steady, clinical, every syllable sharpened by the years she'd spent keeping people alive under impossible conditions. "Vance, listen to me," she said into the headset. "They're hemorrhaging. Their compensatory mechanisms are failing. If you want to force Torres's hand without firing a single extra round, you make her believe the organ, the whole operation, will be lost unless she cooperates." The screen, the monitors told the story in thin, merciless lines. the arterial tracing sloping down, the heart rate creeping up, the oxygen numbers flirting with danger. In the sterile rectangle of the feed, Simon's hands moved like a man on autopilot, suturing as if practiced motions could somehow erase the gun at his temple. Behind him, Torres's jaw clenched. Every second the patient bled was profit slipping from her grasp. Vance swallowed and then keyed the radio. "Medical plan," he said tersely to the command staff. "Charlotte has a maneuver. We don't cut life support. We threaten organ viability, make it a bargaining chip. Prepare to disable non-life support power feeds on my mark. I want a show of control without killing anyone." There was a wary murmur of assent. It was a razor-edge plan. Surgical. Surgical in its cruelty and in its precision. Cut the perfusion and refrigeration feeds, the ones keeping the organ viable and the pumps running. And Torres would face a choice between completing the transaction she'd banked on or surrendering to save her investment. Do it wrong, and you risk murder. Do it right, and you force her to choose. Charlotte's instructions were precise and cold. If you cut the perfusion feed, be ready to take over ventilation and vascular access immediately. We deploy medics to assume airway and circulation support the instant the feed drops. I'll talk to him. I might be able to buy a few minutes. But we need the tactical teams in position to act the moment she blinks. Vance's voice was low when he took the open channel back to Torres. "Maria, you have options," he said, carefully neutral. "We can help your patient survive. We can prevent loss, but you have to cooperate. Stand down, release the doctor, and we'll coordinate care. Or you force our hand, and we will take steps that will jeopardize what you're trying to move out of here." For a long, sharp minute, Torres said nothing. On the feed, her face was a mask of fury and calculation. The guards shifted, uncertain, the running clock in their heads audible only to those who'd lived by payments and deadlines. Then she laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think you can threaten me with my own money?" she spat. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Charlotte didn't falter. She addressed the room and Simon. The camera framed their faces, with a voice that tried to thread tenderness through steel. "Simon, hold him," she said softly, as much to the surgeons in the fob as to the man in the bunker. "I'm going to talk you through stabilizing the airway if you can't fully control it. Focus on the ventilation. Keep his end-tidal carbon dioxide stable. If they try to cut the perfusion feed, move to euvolemic resuscitation and secure a compression device. We will be ready to cross over immediately." On the ground, the med team synchronized like a second operating theater. Ventilators warmed, manual bags uncapped, peripheral access kits staged, warming blankets readied for an immediate transfer. The tactical team snapped into the cover position Charlotte had requested, not to storm, but to show intent. And to be ready, the instant medical necessity required forcible extraction. Torres barked a counter, a demand of her own. "If you touch our pumps, you kill the organ, and the buyer will hunt every one of you to the end of the earth." Her eyes flicked to Simon. For the first time, the calculation in them wavered. The money, the reputation, the years of careful construction of a facade. She had staked everything on the survival of that transplant. Vance's reply was quiet and lethal in its simplicity. "Then tell us what you want. Put down the gun, release the doctor for medical assessment, walk out with a promise of safety. Refuse, and we proceed to preserve life on our terms." The delay stretched. On the monitor, the patient's pressures dipped another whisper. Simon's hands trembled as he finished a stitch. For a moment, his face lost color. Charlotte's throat tightened. This was the point where calculation met conscience. Slowly, as if bargaining with fate itself, Torres made a demand that exposed the last jagged seam of her arrogance. She wanted a short medical liaison, Charlotte herself, to speak directly to the operating room, to assist in stabilizing the patient while Torres watched. It was an odd concession, an admission that she valued the organ more than her own theater of control. Vance threaded the offer through like bait. "We will only place Dr. Alcott on comms if you release Dr. Alcott to a neutral area for assessment once the patient is stabilized," he said. He punctuated the words with a promise of immediate extraction team positioning and a coded countdown, a signal that the tactical element was ready to act the instant they got the green light. Torres hesitated, then barked an order. The camera caught her narrowed eyes and a tiny ragged breath. "Fine," she said, "but I maintain control. No tricks." Her tone held threat and bargaining both. Charlotte's voice softened when it went live into the bunker feed, a paradoxically soothing instrument. "Simon," she said, "I'm with you. Keep the airway. Don't let the ATCO2 climb. I'm watching your waveform. I can talk you through adjustments. I need you to steady your hands." Across the wire, something shifted in Simon's face. Recognition, then steadiness. He answered in a small whisper that was all the encouragement the room needed. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I'm with you." On the ridge, the teams tightened. The perfusion feed was on a knife edge. Charlotte and the medics had prepared to assume total support the instant it fell. The countdown began. Vance's watch, a breath, a silent prayer. The patience of the hunted and the hunters braided together. And for a brief, pulsing moment, the standoff sat on a hinge. A fragile alignment of medicine, law, and raw human will. The next move would decide not only the fate of a single patient and a captive surgeon, but the moral weight of an entire operation waged in the desert. Charlotte kept her voice low and steady, and through the crackling comms, she gave the orders that might save them all. Charlotte didn't stop. She rode the thin edge between bluff and biology, layering interventions with the calm, exacting voice of someone who had spent a lifetime holding hearts steady. Increase the norepinephrine to 0.1 micrograms per kilo per minute. Titrate to maintain mean arterial pressure above 65. Give a 1-gram bolus of calcium chloride. Slow IV push. Start warmed crystalloid. 2 liters, wide bore, rapid infusion. Prepare 2 units of cross-matched PRBCs for immediate transfusion. Her words moved through Torres like a spell. The camera caught Simon's hands as he made the adjustments, fingers shaking only once before they steadied. The vasopressors climbed. The arterial tracing eased from the edge of collapse into a fragile plateau. The oxygen saturations recovered a few points. In the fob, the medics exhaled, as if released from pressure. For the first time in hours, the numbers looked salvageable. Vance used that breathing space. He keyed the channel and spoke softly, but with steel. "Maria, you value this organ. You can walk away with your money and your organization intact if you let him go for a medical assessment. A neutral area, guarded, and then we discuss terms. If you refuse, we proceed with the plan to cut the perfusion feed." Torres's laugh was tight, bitter, and edged with panic. For a long beat, she made no promise. Then, finally, "Fine. 1 medical liaison, 1 assessment, 5 minutes. If you move, the patient dies, and so does your surgeon." Her voice was a thin wire of menace. "Agreed," Vance answered. 1 liaison, 5 minutes, neutral area, immediate extraction after assessment." He spoke to Charlotte without taking his eyes off the screen. "You okay with this?" Charlotte swallowed, the weight of the decision heavier than anything she'd ever had to make at an operating table. "I'll do it," she said. "But we go on our terms. Medic staged, tactical cover, we get him out within that 5-minute window." They arranged it with rigid choreography. A small, shielded staging room just outside the operating suite would be declared a medical assessment area. Charlotte would be connected verbally to Simon, then step into the room under escort. 2 medics would be positioned to assume airway and circulation at once. Tactical teams fanned the nearby corridors, ready to close the net the second Simon cleared the doorway. On camera, Torres watched like a hawk as the plan unfolded. She released her grip on the pistol only marginally, her finger never far from the trigger. The guards shuffled closer, to her side. Simon, pale but steadying, met Charlotte's eyes when the liaison channel opened. The look they shared was brief and molten, recognition, love, apology packed into half a breath. "Hold on," he mouthed. She felt it like a vow. Charlotte's voice into the bunker was gentle now, clinical and fierce both. "Simon, I need you to prepare for transfer. Secure the airway, maintain ventilator support. I'm coming in on the liaison. Don't move until my signal." He nodded minutely. The camera followed him as he finished securing lines and sealed the surgical field as best he could under the watch of armed men. The corridor outside the operating suite was a taut wire of men in black and medics in gloves. Charlotte walked in, flanked by a tactical physician and 2 HRT medics, her Kevlar vest feeling heavier than before. Torres watched her approach like a queen watching a bargain. She did not relax. The 5 minutes began on Vance's countdown. Inside the neutral room, Charlotte assessed Simon in 60 heartbeats that were both a surgeon's checklist and a marriage of small mercies. Airway secure, ventilator settings confirmed. 2 large-bore IVs, blood warming, pressure improving. She pronounced the immediate crisis stabilized. At Vance's 1-minute mark, the extraction protocol snapped into motion. HRT operators sealed secondary corridors. Medics rolled the stretcher, and a rapid evac team moved to the door. Torres, sensing the closing trap, made a last verbal lunge, a torrent of threats and accusations. But it was overlaid by the mechanical certainty of trained teams closing squares and the clinical fact that her patient's life, and the value she'd built everything around, was suddenly fragile and negotiable. When Simon was lifted onto the stretcher and carried past Torres, guarded, pale, alive, the compound's calculus finally broke. In the chaos that followed, tactical teams secured Torres and her inner circle. The longer game of prosecutions and international arrests began as men were cuffed, evidence cataloged, and the bunker's horrors were exposed to daylight. Charlotte rode in the medevac with Simon, holding his hand as the rotors shook the air. She didn't speak much. Words felt small. Later, at the field hospital, the slow work of undoing a 5-year absence began. Fluids, antibiotics, nutrition, and the patient, a human who had been through an ordeal, finding his way back to breath by breath. It was not a perfect rescue. There were survivors who would carry scars for life, evidence of crimes that could never be fully erased, and questions that would haunt courtrooms and hospital boards. But in the small, fierce moments inside that bunker, medicine had been used as a weapon for both harm and salvation, and a single anesthesiologist's voice had helped tip the balance toward rescue. Charlotte's fingers trembled as she clasped Simon's hand, fragile, weightless, but alive. Heartbeat. The chaos of the rescue faded. The shouts, the rotor thunder, the crackle of radios all melted into background noise. In that moment, there were only 2 people, a surgeon and an anesthesiologist, husband and wife, tethered by 5 years of silence and one impossible rescue. His skin was cold, clammy with shock, the pulse beneath her thumb thin but steady. "Simon," she breathed, her voice breaking with disbelief. His lips moved again, the ghost of a smile struggling through exhaustion. "You came for me." The words were barely there, but they carried the weight of survival. She wanted to say everything: the sleepless nights, the relentless search, the endless hope that refused to die. But all she managed was, "I never stopped." The medics guided her back gently as they worked, securing lines and monitoring his vitals. "We need to get him on fluids and pressors now," one of them said. Charlotte nodded, her professional instincts slipping into place even as her heart ached. "Keep his MAP above 65. Watch his lactate levels. He's in distributive shock," she murmured, more to herself than anyone. The medic shot her a look, respect and recognition. They all knew who she was now. Vance approached from the edge of the landing zone, his tactical gear dusted with sand, eyes red from exhaustion. "We got her," he said simply. "Torres is in custody. The rest of the compound's secure." Charlotte barely registered it. The victory felt hollow next to the fragile man lying on the stretcher, the man who had vanished from her life and somehow, impossibly, returned. As the helicopter blades picked up speed again, the desert around them came alive in the dawn light. The horizon burned gold and crimson, painting the sand in shifting shadows, like a world being reborn after a long, merciless night. Charlotte climbed aboard, taking her place beside Simon. Her hand stayed wrapped around his, grounding him, refusing to let go. Inside the medevac, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors became the new heartbeat of their story. Simon drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering fragmented memories, names, procedures, moments of captivity blurred by painkillers and darkness. Charlotte listened, tears streaking her dust-covered face. Every word another piece of the puzzle she would one day have to face. But not now. Now was for survival. When they landed at the Forward Field Hospital, Simon was rushed into the trauma bay. Charlotte followed close behind, her scrubs streaked with desert grit and blood. The medical team took over. IV lines, intubation, warming blankets, an orchestra of urgency. She stood back, watching through the glass, the scene both painfully familiar and achingly surreal. The same rhythm she had lived by for decades. Only this time, the patient was her husband. Hours later, as the chaos softened into the hum of machines and whispered updates, Charlotte sat by Simon's bedside. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust. The first real sunlight poured through the window, gilding the white sheets in gold. Simon stirred, his eyes fluttering open. For the first time, they weren't hollow. They held recognition, warmth, and a flicker of the man she'd loved before everything went dark. "Hey," she whispered. He blinked, a small, fragile smile forming. "Still giving orders, huh?" A wet laugh escaped her. "Somebody has to keep you alive." The world outside was still burning with the aftermath. Investigations, arrests, headlines that would soon circle the globe. But here, in this quiet, sterile room, the noise couldn't reach them. For the first time in half a decade, the nightmare had ended. Charlotte leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his hand. "You're home," she whispered. "You're finally home." And as the steady rhythm of Simon's heart filled the room, she let herself believe, really believe, that the light had returned. The desert, once a place of loss and despair, had become the place of their resurrection. Would you like me to continue this story with an epilogue that shows what happens months later? How Charlotte and Simon rebuild their lives after the trauma and the truth about what really happened in that bunker comes to light? His skin was cold and clammy, the tremor in his fingers betraying the depth of his exhaustion. "I'm here, Simon. I'm here. You're safe." Tears streamed down Charlotte's face, the overwhelming emotion of the moment crashing down on her like a wave. The reunion was frantic, painful, a tangle of agony and relief. The man she had lost was not the man she had found. 5 years of captivity had changed him, broken him, carved the warmth from his eyes. Simon gripped her hand, clinging to her as if it were the only real thing left in the world. His body was depleted, his spirit hollowed out. The sudden transition from the darkness of the bunker to the blinding desert sun was too much. His senses overloaded, his mind caught between worlds. Charlotte climbed into the helicopter with him as the medics moved efficiently around them, checking vitals, starting fluids, securing oxygen. The rhythm of medical procedure steadied her, a familiar anchor amid the storm. She recognized the signs of deep trauma, the vacant stare, the trembling hands, the shallow, rapid breaths. The 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who had survived the unthinkable. She drew up a mild sedative, her touch steady, her voice low and soothing. The gesture, the careful precision of her movements, was something Simon's fractured mind recognized. A fragment of the life they had shared, the connection that had survived the years of silence. As the helicopter lifted off, Charlotte looked down at the compound, the scarred desert, the shattered bunker, the graveyard of Torres's empire. 5 years of pain buried beneath the sand. The victory was hard won. The cost was immeasurable. Simon slept, the sedative easing his ragged breathing. His chest rose and fell in rhythm with the hum of the engines. She watched him, exhaustion and disbelief washing over her in waves. He was alive, broken, but alive. And for now, that was enough. Weeks later, San Antonio Medical Center. The sterile white walls felt like sanctuary, a fragile peace after years of confinement. Simon's body was mending, nutrition and hydration slowly restoring the shell that captivity had left behind. But the mind was another battlefield. The nightmares came first, violent, vivid, relentless. Then the flashbacks, sterile rooms, metal tables, the endless hum of surgical lights. He would wake in a cold sweat, gasping, his pulse spiking with remembered terror. Charlotte was always there. She was his anchor, calm, patient, unyielding. She sat through the long nights, holding his hand when the panic took hold, reminding him that the nightmare was over. When he finally spoke, the words came haltingly, fragmented memories stitched together by pain. He spoke of the ambush on the Massachusetts Turnpike, the blindfold, the chloroform, the first time he saw Torres, the underground halls that smelled of antiseptic and fear, the surgeries, dozens of them, each one a crime, each one a piece of his soul cut away. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again," he said one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was already dead." Charlotte said nothing. She just reached for his hand. "I was a ghost in a machine," he continued. His gaze was distant, haunted. "That's what the ID card meant, the one you found." The words hit her like a jolt, the tiny laminated card that had sparked the investigation, the one that bore his name and a strange string of numbers. "It was my last act of defiance," he murmured. "I knew they were replacing me. I overheard Torres talking about it, training someone new. I knew what that meant, liquidate the primary asset." His voice broke, raw and trembling. "I had one chance to leave something behind, something you could find." Charlotte's throat tightened. For 5 years, that card had been her lifeline, the proof he was still out there somewhere. Now, it was the proof he had never given up. He had hidden the card inside Victor, knowing it would one day cause complications, knowing it was the only way to send a message to the outside world. It was a desperate gamble, one that relied on the eventual failure of his own surgical work. "I risked a life to save my own," Simon whispered, his voice breaking. The guilt was carved into every line of his face, the moral weight of his confession pressing down like lead. "I violated the most sacred oath. Do no harm. I became the very thing I swore to fight against." Charlotte reached for his hand, her voice soft but steady. "You did what you had to do to survive, Simon. You are not one of them. You are not their monster." But deep down, he wasn't sure he believed her. The days that followed were a blur of slow healing and painful reflection. Some mornings, Simon wouldn't speak at all, trapped in the looping echoes of the past. Other days, he'd reach for Charlotte like a man drowning, his fingers clutching hers as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the present. Then came the request. Victor Ramos, the patient, the man whose body had carried Simon's secret message, wanted to meet him. The reunion was heavy with silence. Victor was still gaunt, the scars of the forced nephrectomy visible beneath the thin hospital gown. His voice trembled as he faced Simon, the surgeon who had cut him open. "You're the reason I'll never be the same," Victor said quietly. Simon bowed his head. "I know, and I will live with that for the rest of my life." But as Simon spoke, haltingly, painfully, recounting the horrors of the compound, the forced surgeries, the moment of defiance when he hid the ID card, something shifted in Victor's eyes. Anger softened into understanding. "You saved me," Victor said finally, his voice breaking. "You risked everything to give me a chance to bring them down. You gave me a second life." The forgiveness in Victor's eyes was more healing than any medicine. For the first time in years, Simon exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to release 5 years of agony. Victor would go on to testify, his words instrumental in exposing the network, his courage a beacon for other victims. Together, he and Simon tore down the silence that had bound them both. And Charlotte, she refused to let the story end there. The ordeal had awakened something fierce within her, a determination to fight back against the shadows that had almost destroyed them. She began working with international agencies, uncovering the weaknesses in the global medical supply chain, the loopholes that had allowed Aegis Global Health to hide a black market empire in plain sight. Her voice became a weapon, her advocacy a lifeline for those still trapped in the dark. Simon's recovery was not a return to the past. It was a reconstruction. 2 lives rebuilt on the fractured foundation of shared trauma. The scars remained, visible and invisible, but they no longer defined them. They were proof. Proof that the darkness had not won, that it had transformed them. 2018. The aftermath of the raid on the desert compound sent shockwaves through the medical world. The arrests were sweeping. The charges, devastating. Maria Torres and the cartel leadership tied to Aegis Global Health were indicted on multiple counts: kidnapping, human trafficking, conspiracy, and murder. For the first time in years, there was light. The facade of humanitarian charity crumbled overnight, exposing the dark anatomy of a global crime. What had appeared to be a benevolent medical foundation was, in truth, a sophisticated organ trafficking empire, one that thrived on the desperation of the poor and the greed of the privileged. When federal agents raided the desert compound, the truth spilled out in chilling detail. Meticulous financial records, encrypted client lists, and communication logs that mapped an empire stretching across continents. Wealthy clients from around the world had quietly paid fortunes for transplants. The supply came not from donors, but from the exploited, the vanished, the forgotten. The revelations triggered a domino effect. Arrests rippled across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Doctors, brokers, administrators, even hospital executives. The entire machinery of the black market organ trade began to collapse under the weight of undeniable proof. Then came the trial, a global spectacle. The media called it the anatomy of greed. Simon and Victor's testimonies shook the world. The cold precision of forced surgeries, the unimaginable cruelty, the humanity stripped away in the name of profit, all laid bare before a stunned public. Maria Torres, the woman who once commanded the network from the shadows, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the first time, justice felt tangible. The organization was dismantled, its assets seized, its operations obliterated. But for Charlotte and Simon, justice came with a quieter cost. They returned to their home in New Hampshire, to the same clapboard house, the same quiet street where snow still gathered on the porch steps. But nothing felt familiar. The air carried the ghosts of those missing years. The silence of the house felt heavier now, filled with memories of what had been lost and the echoes of what could never be reclaimed. Simon tried to find his footing, but the operating room, once his temple, had become his trigger. The sterile lights, the smell of antiseptic, even the rhythm of the heart monitor, all of it sent him spiraling back to the bunker. His hand, once instruments of healing, trembled now with unspoken guilt. Charlotte, ever steadfast, turned her anguish into action. She became one of the leading voices in the global fight against medical trafficking. From Washington to Geneva, she spoke with fierce clarity about what she had seen: the loopholes, the corruption, the invisible machinery that allowed human suffering to become a commodity. Her advocacy inspired reforms. Her testimony changed laws. She refused to let their pain end in silence. Years passed. Time did not erase their scars, but it softened them. The memories remained, but so did the light. Simon eventually found peace not in the operating room, but in the classroom. He began teaching again, not how to make the perfect incision, but how to protect the soul behind the scalpel. His lectures carried the weight of a man who had seen the thin line between medicine and monstrosity. Every life you touch, he told his students, is sacred. Never forget what it means to hold a beating heart in your hands. And somewhere in that quiet, ordinary life, in the slow rhythm of teaching and healing, of coffee at dawn and walks through the maple-lined streets, Charlotte and Simon found something like peace. The Alcott maneuver, once a desperate medical ploy in the heat of chaos, became something far greater, a symbol of defiance, a testament to survival, a reminder that even when humanity is pushed into the darkest corners, there is always a way back to the light. Because sometimes, hope isn't loud. Sometimes, it's just the steady pulse of two people who refuse to give up on each other and on the world. In the end, the story of Simon and Charlotte Alcott wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption, about the strength it takes to rebuild when everything you've known has been destroyed. The darkness they endured didn't define them. It transformed them. From tragedy, they built purpose, and from loss, they built hope. Maybe that's what the Alcott maneuver truly meant all along. The courage to act when all seems lost, and the belief that even in the darkest corners of humanity, the light can still find a way through. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments below what part hit you the hardest. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life mysteries that remind us of the power of the human spirit.